Our symposium. Today we are moving to Latin America, at least for this session, as we are already living in the church, a very important event of the Synod of Amazonia. So today we have the pleasure to listen to a talk of Professor Maier, who is the Secretary of European Affairs of the Jesuit European Social Center in Brussels. He is a specialist in theology of liberation, about Oscar Romero and El Salvador. So we are really happy to have a specialist in the field. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Jaroslaw. Good morning to everybody. A German Jesuit speaking in Macau about Jesuit martyrs in El Salvador. Is this craziness? Is this Jesuit globalization? I opt for the latter, and the reason why I stand here today is because I was in El Salvador 30 years ago, and my personal life story is closely linked with the story of El Salvador. The Jesuit martyrs of El Salvador, I knew all, and it's a story of grace. And I apologize also with all the English native speakers for all the harm I will do this morning to the wonderful language of St. John Newman. And I start with the cross. This talk is under the sign of the cross, and on this cross are 8 faces. And I start at the bottom with the face of Elba Ramos, a Salvadorian woman who was the cook in my community, nearby, 15 minutes foot walk, and her husband Obdulio, he was the gardener in the university, and they had a little house on the campus, but a bit exposed, and as it was heavy civil war at that night, they thought the women would be safer in the room of the Jesuits, and that's why she and her daughter Selina that night slept in a room of the Jesuit building, and the soldiers had the order to leave no witnesses of the massacres, and they killed also Ella and Selina. And for me this is very meaningful that the Jesuits dedicated and gave their lives for the Salvadorian people, and two women of these people died with them. Then we have the face of Joaquin Lopez y Lopez. He was the eldest and the only Salvadorian born. He was one of the founders of the university, which was founded in 1952, and he was at that moment the director of Fe Alegria, which is a social network of schools in poor neighborhoods. Then we see Juan Ramon Moreno, who was a theologian, a former novice master. In the middle, Ignacio Ellacuría, the most well-known rector of the university, renowned philosopher and theologian. I did my doctoral thesis on his theology, on Sobrino's theology. At the right hand, Segundo Montes, who was a sociologist and director of the Human Rights Institute. And at the left, Ignacio Martin Barro, who was a social psychologist investigating especially the consequences of the war for children. And at the end, Amando Lopez, also a theologian and a very pleasant person. 3 weeks before he died, I was at the Red Cross to give blood for, if you have an operation in El Salvador, the family has to look themselves for blood conserves. And he invited me to accompany him, and I didn't suspect at that moment that 3 weeks later he would give all his blood for the Salvadorian people. I just continue with some photos. That's on the morning of the 16th of November 1989. The soldiers dragged them out of their rooms. They had to lay down in the grass, and they shot from a very short distance with heavy guns. And in front is Ignacio Martin Baró, in the brown suit, Ignacio Ellacuría in the white Segundo Montes. They not only killed 8 people, but they also tried to make understand that there was a heavy fighting, because they said the Jesuits are guerrillas, and they burned the rooms of the theological faculty. And this is a photo of Archbishop Romero, burned, and it's also very meaningful because Romero was the model of these Jesuits, and all of them have been in a close relationship. Ellacuría, theological political counselor of Romero. So we have to see this deeply connected with Romero. They shot books. This is a theological dictionary in the library. It's expression of a senseless hatred. And these are bones, mortal remainings, not of the Jesuits, but of children, of one of the most cruel massacres in the civil war in El Salvador, in El Mozote, and rests also of arms. 800 women and children slain in this remote city in the countryside at the border of Honduras. And if we speak of the 8 Jesuits with names, we have to remember that there are thousands nameless who became victims as they became victims. This is the place where they have been murdered, as you find it today, a rose garden. And this was intuition by Odulio, the father of Selina, the husband of Elba, to plant roses. And he planted 6 roses of red color, symbolizing the Jesuits, and 2 white roses, see it here, symbolizing his wife and his daughter, the symbol of love, and the symbol that love is stronger than hatred and than death. This is the tomb of the Jesuits in the University Chapel. Meanwhile, it's a bit changed, but again, Archbishop Romero patronizing in some way his tombs. And this is a memorial in a city park of San Salvador, the memorial to the memory and the truth. And it brings together more than 25,000 names, remembering the victims of and of violence. And among them, the names also of the Jesuits. Maybe let's go back to the Rose Garden, and I will start now my talk, which I have written down. And I entitled it Contemplativus in Actione Justitiae. And this is genial intuition by Ignacio Ellacuría to extend the theme of our symposium, Contemplativus in Actione, to Contemplativus in Actione Justitiae, to be contemplative in the action for justice. And it brings together faith and justice, which is the definition of the Jesuits in today's world. I will talk first about the crime itself, then a bit about attempts to clarify judicially. I will talk about science at the service of the poor. I will talk about the church historical dimension, some reflections also on the present situation of El Salvador, and I will end with the ambivalence of memory. Some crimes have a historical dimension. This applies to the murder of the 6 Jesuits and the 2 women in El Salvador in several respects. A few days earlier, the Berlin Wall had fallen, the beginning of the end of the Cold War. But in El Salvador, the civil war that broke out in 1980 became really hot again. It was also a proxy war in the East-West conflict. Since November 11, the left-wing guerrillas have led a nationwide military offensive and occupied a third of the capital, San Salvador. The army felt its back to the wall and ruthlessly bombed entire districts. On the evening of November 15th, the entire army leadership gathered and decided to take on the alleged heads of the insurgents. And there is a detail which was related by one of the officers. At the end of this meeting, they stood up, they took each other by their hands, and they said a prayer that everything will go well. It's incredible. A special command was sent to the Central American University, José Simeón Cañas, UCA, of the Jesuits. The soldiers dragged the fathers out of their apartment, forced them to lay down in the grass and shot them at close range. We have seen the photo. The brain mass of the university professors, swollen from the skulls, became a macabre symbol. Spirit was to be killed here. Here the perpetrators and their backers once again believed that by killing people they could get rid of their disliked ideas. Why were these 6 Jesuits and the 2 women killed? The shortest answer can be read on the gravestone in the university chapel. Here the most important mission of the Society of Jesus in our present time is described, as formulated by the 32nd General Congregation in 1975. What is to be a Jesuit today? It is to engage under the standard of the cross in the crucial struggle of our time, the struggle for faith, that struggle for justice, and that struggle for justice which it includes, faith and justice. With this basic decision, the Jesuits wanted to respond to the worldwide injustice as the most urgent challenge of the present. Prophetically, however, the Assembly also predicted we will not work for justice without paying a price. This sentence is also engraved on the tomb, and it's the title of a book written by Father John Sobrino Pagan El Brecio, remembering his companions, remembering his community. Some remarks on the judicial side of the affair, judicial and political side. The case of the Jesuits, El caso de los Jesuitas, as it was called, became a political issue of the first order. At first, the army and the government tried to blame the guerrilla, as we have seen, but this building of lies quickly collapsed. For the first time, the army was on the defensive. A special scandal was also that the US embassy was involved in the cover-up maneuvers, and a military advisor even knew in advance about the planned crime without doing anything. A Salvadorian officer once said that nothing had harmed the army as much during the years of the war against the guerrillas as these murders ordered by the army itself. Last but not least, it was the moral indignation at the crime in US public opinion that finally contributed to a change in the US government's policy. Under the auspices of United Nations, peace negotiations began in April 1990. The Peruvian Álvaro de Soto led these negotiations as representative of the then UN Secretary General Javier Pérez de Cuellar, also a Peruvian. Looking back, he emphasized, Álvaro de Soto, the key importance of the Jesuit murders for the negotiations. I quote of the introduction to a book written by Teresa Whitfield on the Jesuits. The Jesuits had to lose their lives to cause the moral indignation that kept the Salvadorian forces on the defensive and forced them to make concessions at the negotiation table, without which lasting peace probably would not have been achieved. The investigation of the murders and the negotiation process were interwoven like a fugue worthy of Bach. It seemed inspired by heaven. So far, Álvaro de Soto. These negotiations led to a comprehensive peace treaty signed in January 1992, but little of which was subsequently implemented. In September 1991, there was a trial in El Salvador in which, for the first time in the country's history, 8 soldiers and officers sat in the dock. However, only 2 of them were convicted. Why only 2? Because the other 6 were part of an elite battalion, El Batallón Atlacat. And the head of the Batallón Atlacat let know in 1991, if one of our men will be convicted, we shall take action. And that meant there will be a military coup. So you see how justice in El Salvador worked at that time, and sadly it's not very different today. So only 2 of these 8 soldiers were convicted, and they were released in a general amnesty in spring 1993. Another problem of the recent history in El Salvador, that there was a general amnesty, but according to the constitution of El Salvador, you cannot pardon crimes against humanity by a general amnesty. So this amnesty was unconstitutional, and that's in discussion till today. Although it is now clear that the entire army leadership was involved in the planning of the massacre, the crime has not yet been solved. After all efforts to reopen the trial in El Salvador had failed, the Spanish human rights organization APDHI and the Center for Justice and Accountability in the United States handed the case to the National Assembly in Spain in November 2008. And the Spanish judge, Eloy Velasco, based his jurisdiction on the universal jurisdiction that exists under the International Criminal Code when crimes against humanity are involved. And I mentioned this, 5 of the 6 Jesuits came from Spain. At least in one case, there was a court hearing in Spain. In 2017, the former Vice Minister for Public Security in El Salvador, who was involved that night of the 15th of November, his name is Inocente Orlando Montano, was extradited by the United States to the Spanish judiciary, because he had left El Salvador and he lived as millions of Salvadorians in the United States, but he had hidden his criminal record. And when the authorities of the United States became aware of this, they extradited him to Spain. And in May of 2019 of this year, in a trial still in progress, the Public Prosecutor's Office in Madrid demanded 150 years in prison for the former colonel of the Salvadorian army, who was demonstrably involved in the murders. let's wait and see how this trial will finish. In El Salvador, justice and reparation remain to be seen. But the Salvadorian people have their own forms of remembrance and reparation. Resettlements of refugees after the civil war were named after the murdered Jesuits, in a special relationship with a community called Ignacio Ellacuría. We have a group of researchers, theologians, philosophers who are investigating about Ignacio Ellacuría. He left an impressive intellectual heritage, 4 volumes of theological writings, 3 volumes of philosophical writings, and political and social writing. Our last meeting was in Mexico in July this year, and 4 years ago we met in El Salvador. We published a book on Ignacio Ellacuría with our research contributions under the title The Grammar of Justice, the legacy of Ignacio Ellacuría for today. And at this meeting in El Salvador, we went to this community, Ignacio Ellacuría. And you can find in many houses, in churches, the pictures of the murdered Jesuits. And we have seen where they were murdered today, roses bloom. Their grave in the university church, like this rose garden, became a place of pilgrimage. Every year in the night from the 15th to the 16th of November, thousands gather in the campus of the university. They sing, they pray, and celebrate their martyrs. And this will also be the case in this year, on their 30th anniversary. I will talk now on science at the service of the poor and focus more on Ignacio Ellacuría, who was the best known of these 6 Jesuits. He was born in 1930 in Portugalete, in the Basque country. He entered in the Society of Jesus in 1947, in the novitiate in Loyola, and a year later he was sent to the newly founded Central American novitiate in Santa Tecla in El Salvador. There was a twinning between Central America and the Basque province, because at that time in Spain you still had many novices, and they could be generous and sent the novices to El Salvador, to Central America. This happened also a couple of years later with young Sobrino, and he told me that after the 30-day retreat, the novice master was asking the novices, and who is ready to go to El Salvador? And after the 30-day retreat, all hands went up. And, so they could choose, and Sobrino was chosen to go to El Salvador, which became his home. He is a nationalized Salvadorian, as were the 5 Jesuits and Ignacio Ellacuría. He studied from 1949 to 1955 classical languages and philosophy in Quito, the capital of Ecuador. Then he went back to El Salvador and taught philosophy in the Interdiocesan Seminary, and from 1958 to 1962 he studied theology in Innsbruck, and he said Innsbruck was worthwhile for Karl Rahner, presented by Professor Gerold Becker yesterday, and he was deeply inspired by the theology of Karl Rahner. That's my little research contribution I published about the influence of Karl Rahner on Ignacio Ellacuría, and I say maybe Rahner is not a father but a grandfather of liberation theology. Another detail, Ellacuría was a very good football player, soccer. And they had a team of the Jesuits, and there was a university championship in Innsbruck. And it seems the Jesuits were on the way to win this championship. And the superior, the rector, he said to himself, if they win, they will become proud. And he stopped it. I still remember how Ignacio Ellacuría, with deep sadness, he told me this little story. So this is his time in Innsbruck, and he was ordained a priest in Innsbruck in 1962. And then he started a philosophical doctorate at the University Complutense in Madrid and wrote a thesis on the Basque philosopher Javier Zubiri. There are discussions if Ellacuría is more a theologian or more a philosopher, but I will not enter in this right now. My impression is that he is even more original in his theological thought. He did his doctorate in philosophy, but let's not enter in this discussion. In 1967, he returns to El Salvador and he began to teach philosophy at the Universidad Centroamericana, the UCA, founded 3 years earlier by the Jesuits in 1963. In 1974, he founded, together with Jon Sobrino, who had come back from his theological studies in Frankfurt, the Centro de Reflexión Teológica, the Center for Theological Reflection, from which later the Centro Monsignor Romero with the Faculty of Theology emerged, where, by the way, I also teach. In 1976, Ellacuría took over the management of the magazine Estudios Centroamericanos, Central American Studies, ECA, which became under him the most important magazine of the country about political, social, economic and cultural questions. He wrote the editorials in ECA, and one of his famous editorials was in 1973 when there were attempts to establish a land reform in El Salvador. One of the major social challenges was the distribution of land, and UCA made a proposal. And the military government at that time was not completely closed to this proposal because they felt that something must change in El Salvador. But the oligarchs, they impeded this land reform, and Ellacuría wrote an editorial in ECA playing with words. A sus órdenes, mi capital. A sus órdenes in English is I am at your service. And it's a military language, my colonel, but he changes one letter, not capitan, but capital. And after this editorial, the government stopped subsidies for the UCA, and the first bombs exploded on the campus. Ellacuría became rector of the UCA in 1979, making it his life's work to implement the option for the poor in a scientific, academic way. And that's the time where he also was a close counselor to Archbishop Oscar Romero. As rector of the university, he repeatedly intervened in public debates and demanded more social justice and respect for human rights. Later on, together with the successor of Archbishop Romero, Archbishop Rivera y Damas, he mediated in the civil war at the beginning of the 1980s in the initiation of peace talks. And he was also one of the most productive liberation theologians. The hatred for him in relevant circles of the oligarchy was boundless. I experienced this the first and the only time I went in El Salvador to the so-called German club, which brings together the Germans in El Salvador. And there are several hundred Germans. And you get good beer and good food, but bad ideology. And I remember a conversation with one of those Germans who was a producer of jewelry for the ladies of the oligarchy. I couldn't mention his name, but I will not do it. And when he became aware that I'm a Jesuit, he burst out with hatred against Ignacio Ellacuría, and he said, this is the man responsible for all the turmoil in El Salvador. And I just listened, and I said to myself, I will never come back to the German club. Between Ellacuría had come to the conviction that in the midst of the misery of the majority of the Salvadorian population crying out to heaven, science could not be done for the sake of science. The Central American University as a university was to advocate social reforms, land reform, with the aim of a fairer social order. It should become the voice of the voiceless. That's how Archbishop Romero once defined his understanding of what it means to be a bishop, to be the voice of the voiceless. And the UCA gave an honorary doctorate to Romero 5 years after his killing, and Ellacuría made a remarkable speech, and he said, we should do as a university what Romero did as a bishop, becoming the voice of the voiceless. But it became more and more also the target of the rich and the powerful. Between 1976 and 1989, 16 bomb attacks were carried out against the university. 4 times the printing house of the university was blown up in ruins. Here the books of the university's own publishing house and 8 magazines, among them ECA, are printed. Ellacuría quoted a Spanish poet who, under the censorship of the Franco dictatorship, said, they don't let people see what I write, because I write what I see. Writing, analyzing what you see, to take up the social political reality as a challenge for the university. This formula describes what these professors were all about. Segundo Montes, as a sociologist and director of the university's Human Rights Institute, was particularly concerned with the fate of the refugees of the civil war. Ignacio Martín Baró, as a social psychologist, dealt with the consequences of the war for children. Armando Lopez and Juan Ramón Moreno taught theology in the line of the theology of liberation, and stood in an intensive connection with church-based communities. And Joaquín López y López was one of the founders of the university. By the way, he was the son of a family of the oligarchy, and they considered him like a black sheep. And he was murdered when he was director of the social organization Fe y Alegría. The UCA was to be different from other Latin American higher education institutions financed by the rich upper class, where only the sons and daughters of the oligarchies received their education. It should be not an island of supposedly pure knowledge, such as the palaces of the rich are islands of prosperity, delimited by walls to the outside in the sea of social misery. And this is the reality of El Salvador till today. A university so enclosed in an ivory tower inevitably contributed to the consolidation of unjust social structures. The UCA as a university should work for social change towards a more just social order. In all this, Ignacio Ellacuría never left any doubt that the university must be a place of intellectuality and methodically used rationality. He pointedly formulated it in various ways. I quote Ellacuría, a university that wants to have a changing effect on society does not need less but more scientific rigor. And I remember when I met him first, this was in Madrid at the beginning of 1989, when he gave a conference to the students of Commemoration University. He told about Salvadorian students who proudly told him that at a visit of the US Vice President, they had thrown eggs. And Ellacuría told them, you should not throw eggs, but statistics. In Eaguria's other words, the UCA scientist must work at his desk, but not from his desk. His scientific work, his or her scientific work, must be based on the reality of the country and aimed at changing it. As for any other university, teaching plays a central role for the UCA alongside research. Today it has more than 9,000 students and more than 300 professors. The aim is to shape the students into actors of social change. In addition to professional qualification, the aim is also to teach them ethical and Christian values. The option for the poor is both the knowledge-guiding premise and the practical objective of their scientific work. Again, in the words of Ignacio Ellacuría, the university must incarnate intellectually with the poor in order to be the science of those who have no access to science, the educated voice of those who have no voice of the voiceless. Because of this work, he continues, we were persecuted hard. If our university had not suffered in recent years from the suffering and death of the Salvadorian people, it would not have fulfilled its university mission, and even less made its Christian orientation visible. In a world where falsehood, injustice and repression rule, a university that fights for truth, justice and freedom can be nothing but a persecuted university. In 1977, when the death courts were ruling in El Salvador and killing thousands and thousands, after the killing of the first Jesuit, Father Rutilio Grande, there was a general threat against the Jesuits. If you don't leave the country within 30 days, we will kill one by one. In these words, you will become military targets. And at that time, Pedro Arrupe was Superior General of the Society of Jesus, and of course he was informed, and he told the Jesuits, you stay. You can take precautionary measures, and that meant that they slept in different houses of friends each night to hide them a little bit. But Arrupe said, you will not move the Society of Jesus with threats. And if they kill more, we shall celebrate a funeral and go on doing our mission. And that's what happened also after the killings 1989. The president of that time, Cristiani, he thought that now the Jesuits definitely will leave El Salvador. The provincial told him the contrary is the case. There are more than 40 Jesuits who volunteered to come to El Salvador to work at the place of the murdered companions. And one among them is Father Michael Czerny, who took over the Human Rights Institute. And you may have noticed that Pope Francis recently appointed him a cardinal. And I became a parish priest in Jayaque, where I had been collaborating with Ignacio Martin Baró on weekends, and Michael Czerny helped out a little bit also in Jayaque. So we are remembering when we meet in Rome these times. I talk now about the church historical dimension of this crime, which is related with the recent history of the Jesuit order and the church. With the basic decision for faith and justice, the Jesuit order adopted the new orientations which the Latin American bishops had decided at their historical meeting in Medellin, in the Colombian city in 1968. In their effort to implement the Second Vatican Council 3 years later after the Council to the situation of Latin America, the bishops there recognized the misery of the great majority of the people living on the subcontinent, crying out to heaven as the decisive challenge for the Church. They drew from it the consequence of the preferential option for the poor, with which they described their basic decision to stand up for liberation and justice in Latin America. At the same time, also a new theology arose, the theology of liberation. In it, faith and justice were brought into a new relationship with each other. And a basic principle of liberation theology is that Christian salvation was no longer only a matter for the hereafter, but also for the here and now. With it, a historical turn in the church history of Latin America was initiated. For centuries, the church in Latin America, apart from a few praiseworthy exceptions, had stood in an alliance with the powerful and the rich. With the documents of the Visual Conference in Medellin, she dissolved this alliance. This alarmed both the Latin American oligarchies and the United States government, which considered especially Central America as their backyard. They wanted to keep under control. The conflict was thus programmed. Putting God in the context of political and economical structures was disqualified as Marxism and communism, a deadly label in Latin America to this day. In El Salvador, this conflict intensified in a special way. The smallest country of Latin America combines all the beauty. It's a wonderful country. It's my second home, but also all the tensions and contradictions of the continent. Traditionally, it was an agricultural country with coffee, cotton, and sugarcane as its main exports. It was ruled by the proverbial 14 families, las 14 familias. In 1932, the army crushed a bloody uprising of the peasants and agricultural workers in the infamous matanza, the slaughter. And there is an estimate that in a few weeks, 30,000 peasants were killed in this matanza in 1932. Until 1979, the country was ruled by military dictatorships that built a makeshift democratic facade. In the wake of a surge in industrialization in the 1960s, trade unions, reformist opposition parties and student organizations formed to push for land reform and social change. In the early 70s, almost half of the fertile land was in the hands of 1.5% of the large landowners, while 87% of the peasants shared just 20% of the fertile land. Growing social polarization and government repression led to a civil war between the leftist guerrilla, FMLN, called Frente Farabundo Martí para la Liberación Nacional, Frente Farabundo Martí for the National Liberation. Farabundo Martí was the leader of this peasant revolution in 1932, civil war between the guerrilla and the army. This war was waged by the United States as an ideological proxy war in the wake of the East-West conflict. They financed it on the side of the army with over $3 billion. Archbishop Rivera y Damas, who died in 1994, commented dryly, "The US supplies the weapons and we supply the dead." In connection with the political repression, a real church persecution broke out in El Salvador in the 70s and 80s. Thousands of committed Christians, 18 priests, 4 nuns, and Archbishop Romero fell victim to it. The first priest to be murdered on behalf of the landowners, together with 2 companions, was the Jesuit father Rutilio Grande in 1977. The process of beatification for the 3 is nearly to completion. Rutilio Grande had learned to read the gospel as a liberating message with the people in the farming village of Aguilares. He often said in his homilies, God does not lie in a hammock up in heaven, but he is among us. Rutilio Grande's murder was decisive for the transformation of Archbishop Oscar Romero from a rather fearful and non-political churchman to a prophetic defender of the poor. Some speak even of the conversion of Archbishop Romero. And this change also manifested itself in Bishop Romero's attitude towards Jesuits. While he had previously taken a critical distance from them, even denounced the theology of Eacuria and Sobrino in Rome, he now chose Eacuria and Sobrino as his closest advisors. A few words, I will come to my end in about 8 minutes. 9:30 is my limit. A few words about the present situation. El Salvador usually only appears in the international media when natural disasters occur, terremotos, earthquakes, or when extraordinary crimes happen, such as the murder of the Jesuits and the 2 women. What does El Salvador look like today? Even 27 years after the signing of the peace treaty, the country's problems are still far from being solved. It is in a difficult and fragile process of transition from civil war to real peace, from decades of military dictatorship to democracy, from extreme social polarization to national reconciliation. The opportunity to come to terms with the worst crimes of the civil war, as demanded by the peace treaties, was lost with the hasty general amnesty of 1993. I mentioned this already. The extent of the violence today is still frightening. Today, at least as many people are victims of murder and manslaughter as in the years of civil war. In 2018, 3,340 people were killed, with a population of about 6 million. This means that 91 out of 100,000 people per year become victims of violent crime. United Nations from 10 of 100,000 speaks of an epidemic of violence. It is one of the highest rates in Latin America. Behind these figures is not only the problem of social justice, but also of the youth gangs, the so-called Maras, who account for 2/3 of all murders. The previous governments tried to counter the problem of violence with a hard hand, then with a super hard hand, but they didn't tackle the underlying reasons, which are still the extreme social differences and the lack of perspectives for young people. How hopeless many people experience the situation in El Salvador is shown by the migration towards the United States. Every day, hundreds of people are expected to set out on the expensive and dangerous journey to the north. In June 2019 of this year, the tragedies associated with this came to the fore for the world public in the form of a photo. It showed the dead bodies of Oscar Martinez and his 2-year-old daughter Valeria, who had drowned in the Rio Bravo border river to Mexico. Sometimes a photo makes visible what is happening in this world. Sobrino sometimes says we live in a big cover-up, and we have to be honest with reality. This is the first step in his theology, honestidad con la realidad. 2.5 million Salvadorians live legally or illegally in the United States. They transferred in 2018 $5.4 billion to their families, the so-called remesas. This corresponds to 20% of the gross domestic product. Thus, the expulsion of 1 million Salvadorians threatened by Donald Trump would also have catastrophic economic consequences for El Salvador. On February the 2nd of this year, a new president was elected in El Salvador, and for the first time he won the elections in the first ballot with more than 50%, the 37-year-old Nayib Bukele. And this is not a Spanish name, but a name from Palestine. He is the son of a rich family which immigrated in El Salvador a couple of generations ago. Bukele is the first politician which does not belong to the two traditional big parties, the right-wing Arena party and the left-wing FMLN party, which grew out of the guerrilla. And Arena ruled the country from 1989 to 2009, and then the left-wing FMLN took over the presidency. Bukele promised in his election campaign to end corruption, overcome the violence of the youth gangs, and create new jobs. However, he has never made it clear how he intends to achieve this. In the parliament, he is dependent on coalitions. His style of government is quite authoritarian. To combat the youth gangs, he called in the army from the barracks and would also like to call on military aid from the US. This brings back dark memories of the past. He skillfully uses the social media, but the hopes that Bukele will bring about real political and social changes are very limited. I end with a short reflection on the ambivalence of remembrance. 2,000 years ago, Jesus of Nazareth articulated the ambivalence of monuments to scribes and Pharisees in polemical sharpness. You build the tombs of the prophet and adorn the monuments of the righteous, saying, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have been guilty of the deaths of the prophets as they were. With this, you yourselves confirm that you are the sons of the murderers of the prophets. Matthew 23. The remembrance of the murdered Jesuits and the two women can today be an impulse to counteract the forgetting and the suppression of the question of justice here and in our time and in the global context of our world. It is a question of overcoming the globalization of indifference, which Pope Francis denounced in the face of the fate of the refugees drowned in the Mediterranean. This reminds us of the great Jewish writer and witness of the Shoah, Elie Wiesel, who said in a speech, I have always believed that the opposite of love is not hatred, but indifference. The opposite of faith is not arrogance, but indifference. The opposite of hope is not despair, it is indifference. Indifference is not the beginning of a process, it is the end of a process. According to the German philosopher Adorno, letting grass grow over stories of injustice leads to the victims and the murdered still being deprived of the only thing that our powerlessness can give them, the memory. It is not about commemoration for the sake of commemoration. The memories of the victims is only real memory if it makes us sensitive to the present suffering of people and if it gives rise to a practice which transforms the structures of injustice. I thank you for your patience and for your attention.